Bruchim Aboim B'Shem Yirgin Shiritor. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from Rav Yaakov Smith, Adini Ksuba V'Kabbalas Kinian, the Ksuba and Halacha. I'd like to give a big yeshikach to Mishpacha Center for sponsoring today's shir. Lili Nishmas, Rav Zachariah Ben Uri, Rav Shalom, Rabbi Center from the Chavkei, who was one of the strongest Mishtatzim and Mechazkim of the shir for many, many years. And Nishmos Tzur B'Tzar HaChaim. Rav Smith.
Well, Hashem, we have simchas, and I always felt that it's worthwhile to learn a little bit about what we're doing. You know, the Masada Kedushin, of course, as we know, the Gemara says in Masechta Kedushin, if you don't know B'tiv Git in the Kedushin, Lo Yeh Eisik Imam, you have to know what you're doing, and that's the oldest klal. If you don't know what you're doing, then don't do it, especially when it comes to Gittin and Kedushin. But for the rest of us who are not Masadri Kedushin, at least we should know the basics, the background, somewhat of an overview and appreciation of what the chosson is. So I want to do today, Bez Hashem, a little bit about the Ksuba, what we have to know about the Ksuba, what it is, what it entails, the different parts of it. And there's no doubt about it, the Ksuba is a very important part of the actual chasana. The Gemara says in Masechta Ksubas, Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis, and the Mechaben in Samach Vav, Siv Gimel, paskins like this, that a person has to have a Ksuba at all times. It's also to be with one's wife, even if you're married for many, many happy years. It's also to be at home without a Ksuba. And that's the whole big sugya. If they lost the Ksuba, they have to replace it, the Ksuba de Irkasa, which is got a different share for a different time. But what's more important, to be without a Ksuba, is also. When does this Issa take effect? Immediately. The Mechaber in Samach Vav Sif Aleph and Even HaEzer says it's also for the chosson to be miyachid with the kallah unless she has a ksuba. To go into the yichid room without a ksuba is also. And there's no doubt about it. If the ksuba is pasul, it's kiyu lo haya. It's as if they have no ksuba. And that's why the ksuba has to be done right. Because without the ksuba, the whole chasana is really ineffective. But what's more interesting, we know, we should never know it, but the halacha that we do learn, the get has to be written with the ultimate perfection. If you look into halacha, how much attention is given to every word of the get, the names, the place, any suffix we avoid, because the get has to be perfect. And the poskim say, ideally, lechatchila, the ksuba should have the same halachas. The Beis Shmuel in Siman Kuf Chav Tes, he writes that if you're not sure what the name was of the couple, when you're giving a get, just look at the Ksuba. Because typically, the Ksuba was written perfectly, and you can look at the Ksuba, and from that you can write the get. And that's why the Beis Shmuel, as I mentioned, and the Nachla Shiva and Yud Beis Tezayin both say, when you write a Ksuba, make sure you're doing a good job. Because you never know, they might rely on that if there's ever an eventual get. And get has to be perfect. So although Lamaisa, as we'll see, the Ksuba is not as chomer as the get. Ksuba is a little less of a level of chiyuv, but no doubt the Ksuba lechatchila should be given the same severity, the same chayma, like we do by a get. Lamaisa, I always wondered why the Ksuba is written in Aramaic, in Aramish. I'll just give you Eitz Tov. If you ever called up to the kibbutz of Ksuba Leinin, and you didn't practice it first, then ask for a different kibbutz. Tell me rather be the sandik. Because the truth is, if you start reading the Ksuba and you never practice, it's going to be a very memorable affair for the people there. They can watch it again and again. It's interesting because the words are extremely challenging. It's real Aramaic. And I always wondered why the Ksuba is in Aramaic. So perhaps the secret is in the Lavush, in Hilchas Gittin, Kuf Chavav Aleph. The Lavush, Talmud of the Ramah, writes an incredible yisoid. And he says that why is the get written in Aramaic? Because the Chachmei HaTalmud that lived in Bavel, their Mama Lashon was Aramaic, and they knew it perfectly, and they were able to incorporate in the Lashon of the get every nuance, every diktuk, every chumrah, in the perfect wording of the get. So therefore, Aramaic, they were most comfortable, and they were able to get everything into those words. So I imagine that's why the Ksuba also was written in Aramaic, to give the same chshivus, kedushin like gittin. I guess that's another form of makish havaya liyitzia. We try to have the kedushin, the same chumrah like the get. Lamaisa, the Ksuba, according to many Rishonim, Taisus and Ksuba's Daf Yud, learns as a chi of deraisa. It's based on the pasuk Kesef Yishkol Kamar HaBesulais. We all remember, right? The Chazal tell us that Yitzchak wrote a Ksuba for Rivka. We know Yosef showed the Ksuba to his father Yaakov. In Parashat Vayechi, Rashi quotes that. So Ksuba definitely has a very early source. I must mention the sheet of the Rambam and Ishas Perek Yud Halacha Yud Zayin. The Ksuba is only midrabanan. And that's the minig of Svardim. What I mean, the minig of Svardim? Because in the Ksuba of Ashkenazim, it's written, Chazu lechi mida oiraisa. We'll soon see it inside in the Ksuba, but the Lashon is, what you deserve mida raisa. That's the minig of Bnei Ashkenaz who go with the Shita of Taisvis, the Ksuba is the raisa. The Ramah says that in Samach Vav, Sivav, the Svardim go with the sheet of the Rambam that Ksuba is only midrabanan. So it's wrong to say Chazu lechi midaraisa. But whatever it's deraisa, the Rabbanon, one thing is important. The purpose, the objective of Ksuba is to protect the Yiddish chassanim. And this is something very important to understand. Why taka do we have a Ksuba? Why is there so much importance? Why is it also to be without a Ksuba? So the Gemara is in Ksuba Daf Yud Aleph and Yevamos Daf Peites. Basically, it's to protect the stability of the marriage. You know, it's Shalom Bayis is sometimes not so simple. It's challenging, and Torah, Chazal, and actually the Rabbi Shalom did so much to protect the Yiddish chassanim. Do we need more than what the famous Gemara that the Rabbi Shalom says? Erase my name. When it comes to Isha Saita, erase my name to bring shalom between Ish ve'ishtay. Well, the Ksuba is another one of these things that we see, how the Torah Kedosha carefully protected the Yiddish marriage. Because what's going to be if Chas Shalom there's a little of a fight and your husband gets angry and he gets a little irrational and a little impulsive? Oh, I'm going to give a get. What's going to stop him? He could give a get, even Bal Karchei Midaraisa. So there has to be a strong deterrent to slow down the process. Zakti Gemara, why is there a chi of Ksuba? Kadesh leite kallah be'einav lahoitzia. That's the Gemara in Ksubis and Yevamis. In other words, if he has to pay a steep price to give a get, he won't be so quick to give a get. I once saw an ad many years ago from a lawyer who was advertising, divorce, $3.99 and it's yours. So, of course, such an attitude, it's, it's disposable marriages, $3.99 is not so bad. Okay, goodbye. But a Yiddish marriage is much more than that. The Mizberach is Meir Demois, one Chil is a Gerushin. So there has to be a very strong deterrent, a built-in, like a sort of a delay that a person shouldn't be quick to give a get. Now, for your information, according to many opinions, the actual amount of the Ksuba with the Tosefes Ksuba is in the range of $10,000. Moshe holds it's more, and the truth is it's logical that it's more because Ksuba has to be support that's sufficient to live alone for a year. Now, how could a person live today with rent so high with $10,000? So it's at least $10,000, and that's supposed to slow down a husband that's upset to give a get. Now you can understand why it's so important, because it has to be something that's going to prevent chas v'shalom an irrational gerush. So once we understand that it could be a deraisa, and it's definitely important, and it's ma'akiv, the actual being together, now let's try to apply it lamaisa. But I think the first and most important thing is the chosson has to know what the Ksuba is all about. The chosson that doesn't prepare for his wedding, he sees, hey, the Masada Kedushin or the Adim are giving me a gift, he's giving me his pen, or giving me his yarmulke or gartel. You're not getting a gift, my friend. We'll soon see that's a chalipin, you're being makna, the shibud of paying a Ksuba. Unfortunately, a lot of chasanim that don't prepare for their wedding, they don't know what they're doing. Pick this up, pick that up. Does he know what he's giving away? I know a lot of masajid kedushin are makbid to tell the chosson what's going on. You are being mishabed yourself on the eventuality there's a get that's going to cost you a lot of money, and some takas say how much it is, but it's not just a formality. I always say this story. Rabbi Shaul Brus was the unofficial Rav in our shul, and he sold the chametz as a service to the Balbatim. And once one of the Balbatim were nifta young, and his almana came to sell the chametz. So Rabbi Brus realized he had to sell the chametz to an almana. She doesn't know what it is, so he explained it very carefully, the details and how what this is, what that is, and she was listening very respectfully. And when he finished, he says, "Umain Rebbe eich euchet von deine Kinder and einiglich Gesundheit." She thought he gave a bracha, so she said Amen. For an almana and mechiras chametz, hechrashti. But for a ben Torah getting married, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's picking up, he's giving, he's getting. It's taka something that it's an avla. The chosson is being mishabed himself to give big money, and this is supposed to give him a perspective about the sanctity of marriage. Lamaisa, I should mention, it just never happens, Khalil, that person decides to give a divorce, and the boy says, no, I never knew what went on, I was never mishabed myself, this, it's not legitimate. You should know the Ramah on the end of Siman Samach Vav writes, an Amoritz that comes to give a get, and says, I didn't know about the Shibud is not Neman, because Dr. Ramah, the Adim definitely explained to him what's going on. So it doesn't help, you didn't know. But I always pointed out, the Ramah says, Amoritz Shebol Garish. Why the Ramah say Amoritz? The Ramah says, because a regular person would never do such a thing. How do you get yourself involved in a contractual obligation and you don't ask what's going on? It means people are supposed to know what's doing, what the shibud is, and how it has a ramification. So let's break it down step by step. First of all, I want to share with you a shaila. Someone was very concerned. He heard that there's an inyan to have a handwritten Ksuba by the chasana, and by his chasana there was a regular standard printed Ksuba. So the question is it a maila to have a handwritten Ksuba, or is it even a printed, which typically a printed Ksuba, they fill in the details. So the emphasis in Svara, why should there be a chiyuv to have a handwritten Ksuba? Bishloim a get, there's a chiyuv of l'shma, it has to be written l'shma. So you have to have written for that couple. But Ksuba, Tainet Rav Moshe in Even Ezer, Chelik Aleph, Kuf Ayin Ches, why should it have to be handwritten? What's wrong with a pre-printed Ksuba? Of course, you have to leave room for the Torah, for the important details, the name and the amount. But the emphasis is, there's more of a maila in having a printed Ksuba. Because the printed Ksuba that was done right has no mistakes, and mistakes can't creep in. But a person that writes the Ksuba handwritten, or you commission a sefer or an artist to write a Ksuba, we're only human. Shkiyos miyavin. And that's why Rav Moshe in that tshuva says he sees people in Madaktik to have a handwritten Ksuba. He doesn't know why. As long as the printed Ksuba is written well, there's no din of lishma. And Rav Moshe says it's a tercha shalei l'tzayrach mamish. In other words, what we say, it's a waste of time. And Rav Moshe saw it from his perspective. Time was so precious. Why are you wasting your time? It's not even a hiddur. The Lahayras Nasan Chelik Hesim and Tzaddik also says that it could be there's a maila in a printed Ksuba because there's less chance of mistakes. And a handwritten, and a artist that writes it, you never know. People are making mistakes. However, there is a psak of the Rukas HaBoisim. This is quoted by his Talmud in the classic Sefer Shulchan HaEzah on Kedushin, page Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. He says, Chadashim Yikarav Bo'o. I see this new minig that people use printed ksubais for the chasana. And his taina is based on a sheet of the shach. Because in Choshen Mishpat Simin Memches Sif Aleph, the Mechaber says that the soifer that wants to get a head start is allowed to write the basic star, and whatever star he wants to write, just leave out the pertinent information, leave out the toirif, the information, but you're allowed to write stars in advance. In fact, he says you're even allowed to write the information before it actually takes place, because there's nothing wrong with writing a star as long as you don't write the date that's improper. The Shach, however, says that according to the Shita of Rashi, you're not supposed to fill out the star, the toirif, the information before it takes place, because a chashash, you might do the same by a get. And the shach seems to go with that shita. Don't fill out a star before it takes place. So tainet the arugas haboisim, a ksuba is not different than a regular star. And maybe it's wrong, like if you have a pre-written ksuba, and sometimes it has some of the information in it, maybe that's wrong, and therefore it has to be pre-written. Now this is the shita of the shach, and the arugas haboisim goes with that shach. However, the Shulchan HaEzer, who's a Talmud of the Arugas haboisim, he writes with great anava, ofani tachas kapos raglav, but he says the minig, at least in his time, was that people used a pre-written, a printed ksuba, and even though the shach is machmir, but the overwhelming majority of the poskim are mekel. And then he adds more than that. And he was a door after his Rebbe, of course. He says, but what I see, these handwritten ksubais are full of mistakes. So what are you gaining by having a handwritten ksuba if the cipher did it sloppily and it's mistakes? A printed ksuba, you know, if it was printed originally right, there can't be mistakes. So his experience showed that it's a mile to have a printed ksuba. The Afarkasta de Anyan Chelik Aleph Siman Pei Aleph, he also says, I don't let these printed ksubas into my cities because they're full of mistakes. So in his times, obviously, the ksubas were full of mistakes. He says, that he did see the Shulchan HaEzer who's mekel. So it seems that in the olden days, the printed ksubas were full of mistakes. Today, it seems that a printed ksuba that's done right is not full of mistakes. Rav Ozna, in a Tshuva Chelik Ches Siman Reish Pei Vav, says, you can't say it's a mile to have a handwritten ksuba. Could be there's a mile to have a printed ksuba, because again, there's no mistakes. But I think we should say that there is a minig, some have the minig, it's the minig of bells, certainly in other circles, to try to have a handwritten ksuba. So I think the proper hachra should be that halacha there's no chiyuv to have a handwritten ksuba. If someone has the minig to use a handwritten ksuba, fine, but eitz tova kamashvalan. The day or two before the chupah, take the handwritten ksuba and show it to a Talmud Chacham, the Masada Kedushin, and make sure he doesn't find the mistake. Because it's better if you find the mistake a day or two before than he finds the mistake right before the chuppah. Then you're going to be in trouble. Now, if someone checked it and it's good, gesund to hate, Rav Ozna says yes. Yeah. Some say it's a maila if it's handwritten and it's done well. But we have to say there is no maila for most shitas of a handwritten ksuba. As long as the printed ksuba was filled out right, that's also the chatchila. Rather, in our times, which is a pretty good option, is a computerized ksuba. The maila with that is, first of all, that the whole writing is one uniform. Sometimes you have a printed and you add with your own handwriting, it's different writing, which is not so, I can't say it's wrong, but it's not as mahudar. A ksuba that was printed on a kesuba, on a computer, you could have the whole writing in one, except for the signing. A computer is not lishma, but that's pashut. There's no concern of the shma regarding a ksuba. So I think we should say that lamaisa, all seem to agree that there's no chiyuv of a handwritten ksuba. If you have that minute to have a maila of doing it, do it right. But typically, the most menhagim today take a printed ksuba and fill in the necessary information, and it's okay. Another question someone once asked: is it a maila or not to have a ksuba written in ksav ashuris? Ksav ashuris, as we know, is the lettering the Sefer Torah is written. What's the shaila? Because in the end of Yeridei Siman Reish Pei Dalid, the Ramah has a shita that you're not allowed to use ksav ashuris for stam dvarim shel chayil. You want to advertise for your business, you decide to be creative, and you're going to advertise with lashon ashuris. You're not allowed to use ashuris for dvarim shel chayil. Based on this, the Minchas Elazar felt that using a ashuris for a ksuba is wrong, because at the end of the day, a ksuba is a financial obligation. It's not a megillah. It's not a mezuzah. It's a contractual obligation. So why is it right to use ksav ashuris? However, I saw both Rav Moshe in Yeridei Chelik Gimel Siman Kufchaf and Rav Ozna in Chelik Ches Reish Pei Vav Hey, both are mechaber to the same yisoid. The mechaber doesn't say, the Ramah doesn't say you only use ashuris for dvarim shebekdusha, for kisvei hakodesh. he says, don't use ashuris for a davar shebechayil. Now, I'm not going to say a ksuba is kisvei HaKodesh. It's not a Megillah. But then again, it's not a davar shel chayil. It's not you're advertising your business, Zok Rav Vozna. It's something that protects the marriage. So as long as it's not a davar shebechayil, it doesn't have to be a kisvei HaKodesh. For Moshe's Medayik, it should have said, don't use ashuris for anything but get. So then you would know ksuba not. Teretz says it doesn't have to be kisvei HaKodesh. It just can be chayil. And a ksuba is not chayil. A ksuba is an integral part of the marriage. So that's why you'll see sometimes people hire a sefer to write it, and we can't say it's an inyan or a hiddur, but we can't say it's wrong because it's not davar shebechayil. Another important question, is it proper to fill out the entire ksuba with the name and even the dates? Just you'll sign it either before or under the chupah, as we'll soon see. Is it proper to fill out the entire ksuba in advance of the chosson? Why should one want to do that? Why should one want to do that? Well, first of all, if you do it at home, you have more yishuv adas, you have more meyushiv, you can do it right. You use by the Kabbalah's panim, and you'll soon see some people fill it out under the chuppah, in fact. So it's very tumuldik. Or someone who's just beginning to be Messiah the Kedushin, he's afraid to fill it out by the chosson and maybe made a mistake. He'd rather do it a day in advance, show his Rabbi, show his Rav, and then he gets an okay. Or some Rabbanim are very busy. They have to give a share that night. They'd rather come just for the chuppah. If you have to fill it out by the Kabbalah's panim, it's an extra hour and a half of their lives. They'd rather do it in advance. So the emphasis I saw in the Sefer Shalmei Simchat Amid Reish Samach Vav, Reb Shlomo Zalman, always filled out the ksuba at home before the chasana. He needed the yishuv adas. We'll soon see Rashi in Nida says that ksuba needs yishuv adas. The only thing he left out was the date. And we'll soon see why the date was different, but basically he left out the date that he filled out by the chasana, but everything he did before the chasana actually. The question is it even mutter to fill out the date? Lamashal, you fill out the chasana is a Beis Nissan, right? And you wrote the Ksuba Aleph Nissan. Can you write today and then write the date Beis Nissan? Why? What's the problem? Because Mais didn't happen yet. It's Merzik Shikra. So the truth is that as long as you didn't sign, so then the whole Ksuba is really invalid. So there's no Merzik Shikra. It's an invalid star. And this seems to be a Ferish Taz. Because in Arachayim Hilchas Chalamoyed, Tafkuf Mem Hey Sif Hey, the Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to write a Ksuba on Chalamoyed, which is very strange because you're not allowed to get married on Chalamoyed. So why are you writing a Ksuba? So one of the Terutzim Zok Taz that they're getting married Taka after Yom Tov. But they can't find someone to write the Ksuba then. So it's a Davar Ha'avad, you're allowed to write it on Chalamoyed. So the Taz says, fine, you can write it on Chalamoyed, but don't put the date Chalamoyed, because then the Zman will be a Mugdam and it's possible. So it's obviously mashma from the Taz that if you write in a Chalamoid and you put the date Chav Zayin Tishrei, it is good. Merzi Keshikra. There it's not Merzi Keshikra. As long as you didn't sign it, you didn't validate it, the whole Ksuba is meaningless. So yes, the answer is yes, you're allowed to write the date in advance, write everything except for the Chasima Sa'edim. You might ask me, the Choshen Mishpat that we mentioned earlier, Mem Ches Aleph, that says you're allowed to write you're allowed to fill out a star before it happens, but don't put in the date. What's that talking about? You don't know when the date will be. So then you can't put in an earlier date. But if you know the chassan will be Gimel Nissan Lamashal, so you can write in advance as long as you don't sign it before Gimel Nissan. And that's why, as I told you, and we'll soon see, the Mephois can say this, there's no Merzi Keshikra unless you signed it on the wrong date. The Minchas Pitim and Samach Vav Aleph, those Lidbu and Tas Nun Vav say that regarding the word V'Kanenim. Rashi and Nida Samach Hayamid Beis, the Maskal Shani writes that writing a Ksuba needs Yishuv Adas, you need time for it. And that's why if you know of some Masaj Kedusha that write in advance, it's Pashit, practically, they want to avoid the tumult of writing it during the actual Kabbalah's Panim. Most Masaj Kedusha write it Taka by the Kabbalah's Panim, and they feel they could do a good job, fine. Now, how do you actually fill out the Ksuba? So I'll ask you, please look at the Ksuba that you should have. For those that are listening, well, you could just imagine a Ksuba. It's really basically pretty simple without seeing it. But if you look at the Ksuba, this Ksuba was written, actually this is a printed Ksuba. It's not perfect Ashuris, but it's pretty close. The beginning of the Ksuba is the actual date, Be B'Shabbos. Be means B'yoim Shlishi B'Shabbos, or B'Shlishi B'Shabbos. Now this is interesting. The date we use, the day of the week. Of course, we don't say Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. We say the third day to Shabbos. Now, it's Pashit, I guess, I didn't find some affairs, but I think it's Pashit. This is based on the famous Ramban in Parshas Yisroi, that if you count Gimel l'Shabbos, Dal l'Shabbos, you make the mitzvah, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos l'Katshai, because you're making Shabbos the center of the week. That's why we say in the Yom every morning, HaYom Yom, Rishon HaShabbos. Zalman used to say, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos l'Katshai, HaYom Yom Rishon HaShabbos. What's the pshat? To give Kedusha to Shabbos. So first we write the day of the week, B'Shabbos, the parasha we don't have to add, and then we say the number of days in the month. And typically we always use a lashon of Zachar, B'Shloishi Yomim L'Chodesh Nissan. So you start off with the day of the week, the day of the month, and the month itself. So just 2 points about the month. First of all, the month of Cheshvan is properly referred to as Mar Cheshvan. That's the actual name of the month. So if it has on Cheshvan, you write Mar Cheshvan. As opposed to Menachem Av, even though when we bench Reish Chodesh, we call it Menachem Av, but the Pischei Tshuva and Even Ezer, Kuf Chavav, Yudalid, Yud Beis, and Aruch HaShulchan, Kuf Chavav, Tezayin, and other poskim also say that the name is not really Menachem Av. The month is Av. Just we are very confident there will be a Nechama, so we add Menachem Av. But in a Ksuba, like in a get, we do not write Menachem, we just write Chodesh Av. Another interesting point that we say L'Chodesh Nissan. If you ever look at a get, you don't use the word Chodesh, you use the word Yerech. Why is that? So there's an incredible lavush in Kuf Chavav Gimel that the word Yerech is used in reference to a get. It's a smichas of the pasuk in B'Zayis HaBracha, Geresh Yerachim. So Gereshin and Yerech has a shaychus, even though in the pasuk itself it has no shaychus to a get, but that's the smichas. Zok the levush. So if the word Yerech has a shaychus to a get, when you have kedushin, stay far away from that. I guess he means like Ayiftach Adam Pel Satan. So use a word more related to kedushin. Kikach ish isha chadasha chodesh. So it's beautiful. The reinkite, the taharas haloshin a yid is supposed to take. Choose words carefully. Yerech, chodesh, what big deal? Big deal, yes. Al tiftach Pel Satan. I always say in the yeshiva, I hear boys talking, learning. If you die, no. You die, I die. No. Don't talk like that. We don't. The Gemara says you're not supposed to show shchita on yourself. Ruvain, not Ruvain. You can pick Ruvain. If there's no boy in the class, Ruvain. Okay, halbatzar. One story, that's why Yaakov said, Yechi Ruvain va'al yamos. He foresaw that Ruvain is going to be the kapur handle. So he said, let Ruvain live. It shouldn't be the one that's always dying. No, if you use a Ruvain as a halbatzar. But Stam, the edel kind of lashon is very much built in even to the Ksuba versus the get. Another point as we continue, Leminyan, and this is number 2, so anumainin kan, and there you add the place where the Ksuba is being written. Now this is not so much to identify where the chasana took place. This is really a different purpose. Because you could count years starting from Melech Pliny or from Yitzias Mitzrayim. How am I going to know what year you're referring to? So we write, in this city we count from Brias HaOlam. So that's why the place is not ma'akiv. If someone left out the place, the Ksuba is good. You know what's worse? If he writes Moinim Kan Hanalulu, the wrong place. Because that's a sheker. But I did see, and it makes sense, let's say the Seif was really a little tzamished, and he wrote Leminish Anumainin Bahanalulu. He doesn't write Kan. So then it's okay. Because no sheker. Because in Hanalulu, like the rest of the world, we count from Brias HaOlam. So either do it perfectly or make a double mistake. But basically, there's a whole protocol how to spell names. I mean, this is really Hilchas Gittin share, because every name has to be spelled, the mark has to be spelled properly. There's a whole tumah to spell the word Munsi. But the Maisa, every name has by now its own spelling. Ramosha writes in Even Ezer, Chelik Daled, Siman Kuf, that New York, Nun Vav Aleph, York is Yud Aleph, Reish Kuf. You could spell New, Nun Yud Vav, but that's like New. So Nun Vav Aleph, Yud Aleph, Reish Kuf, and other than each name will spell the way it has a Kabbalah to be spelled. If someone taka is getting married in a place where there's not typically any chosson, is Lamashla Zivik Sheni, So the Masada Kedushin has to do his homework and find out what should be the proper spelling for that name. The next question is important, is of course, as we continue on, the Ksuba is the name of the chosson and the kallah. So the emes is by a get, then every nickname is added, which is a big challenge for a Masada get. His name is Chaim Tzvi, Herschel, Heshi, Tzili, any nickname or possible nickname got to be in the get. But here we see an obvious difference between Kedushin and Gerushin. You don't write all the nicknames, you just write the proper name that was given by his bris. In other words, if his name is Chaim Tzvi, but no one calls him Tzvi, doesn't make a chilek. He's called to the Torah Chaim Tzvi, and that's it. No miskaria, no nicknames. So the full name, the way it was given by a bris, of course a girl didn't have a bris, doesn't call to the Torah, but the full name that she was given when she was called, but when she was born. It also is an insistence to keep the full name as opposed to, like some people write, Elia instead of Eliyahu, or Shalom, you leave out the mem, or Gedalia instead of Gedalyahu. If his name is Gedalyahu, so you don't have to call him that, but if that's his real name, write the full name, even if he's not called that way. If that's his name, it should be written. Another point which is kedai to mention, by a get, it says twice in Evanez, Kuf Chav Tezayin and Kuf Lamed Yud Aleph, to avoid writing titles. Keep it strictly names. By Kedushin, that should also be the way it's done. Mr. Mizalmo is very makbid, as many others are. Keep the titles for Chveis when you speak about him. Habachar, Hakala, but more than that is superfluous. I rather saw, fascinating, I saw a copy of the Ksuba of the Steipler himself when he got married in Vilna. His Masada Kedushin was the Heilige Reb Chaim Oizer. Chaim Oizer obviously wrote the Ksuba, his name, and each time he wrote Harav Reb Yisrael Yankov, from Chaim Peretz. Interesting, every time he wrote Harav Reb, so I was still surprised. So someone told me that the Steipler learned in the Varduk, and there was a system of how a person, he went up in the yeshiva, and the Steipler was, of course, he was Steipler and he was young as well, and his title was Harav Reb as a Bacham. So that became his name. I imagine that's why the Chaim Oizer wrote like that. But typically, titles are left out. I should mention a Chacham, Reb Shlomo Zalman, once came to a chassan Masada Kedushim, and the chassan had a printed Ksuba written by an artist. And he said, the Ksuba was beautiful. It was very much to his liking. But one thing bothered him, that they wrote chosson Harav. I never did that. So he was thinking of writing another Ksuba. And he said, what's going to be in 20 years from now? Someone will say, I was by your chassan, I'm Shlomo Zalman Paskin, you're not a Rav. He wrote a new Ksuba. Kvar Hoyra Zokin, that you're not a Rav. He said, I don't need that on my Achrayas. He says, I kept it as it is, but it didn't appeal to him writing Harav. A little of an issue is if the chosson or the kallah's father is a Talmid Chacham Muflig, so you can't write Ben Stam Reb, and don't forget, by a Ksuba is read publicly, and all the family is there, and they hear how their father is called Reb. So then there's more leeway to write Harav Reb, or whatever it is, but basically it should be done within reason. A fascinating observation I saw as early as Maram Mintz in the Chuvas and Simon Kuf Tes, and just you'll appreciate if you look in the actual Ksuba, the first time it says the chosson's name, again, typically doesn't say no, just calls him Bachar so-and-so, and the kallah so-and-so. The second time they mention of the chosson's name, and on this Ksuba, you'll see it on number 6, Chassan Denan. The second time we mention the kallah's name is now it's Moras. The first time is the Psulta so-and-so. The next time around, it calls him a chosson and Hara Moras. So the Maram Mintz wonders why not the first time calling him a chosson and Hara Moras. He says, it's Pashta Teres, Dr. Maram Mintz. Because in the beginning of the Ksuba, there was no agreement to get married. So he's not a chosson yet. He's tam a bacha. She's tam a girl. After they agreed to get married, then already it passes the name chosson for him, and for her she's a moras. Now that's interesting because the emes is, we think that when is he considered a chosson? Some say right after the afruf because he has to have a shomer. Some say the day of the chassan he has to have a shomer. He's a chosson. No, lagabi shomer, maybe that's true. But when does he have the halacha of a chosson? The truth is really when he makes kedushin, some type of kedushin. And in the beginning of the Ksuba, he's not yet a chosson. In fact, there's a minhag attributed to Reb Chaim that you're supposed to put the ashes on the chosson's forehead, not before the chuppah, but after the kedushin, when has Hashem chosson. Okay, that's not done in most circles, but I think the point to mention is that how the Ksuba was written with such great precision. Originally he's tamna bach and she's a psula. After they agreed to get married in the Ksuba upon him, then it's a chosson and a moras. If the chosson is a kohen or a levi, of course you write that's a great yichus, but at the place they don't write Chaim Levi, because first of all you might think that that's his name. Also, the proper place to put Levi would be Chaim ben Shloima ha-Levi. Why ha-Levi? Because again, if you write ben Shloima Levi, they'll think the father's name is Shloima Levi, and this father's name is only Shloima. So you put it Chaim ben Shloima ha-Levi, or Chaim ben Shloima ha-Koyen. Obviously, if the father's a Koyen, then the chosson is a Koyen. If the kallah is, of course, a bas Kohen or Bas Levi, so she doesn't have a yichus of Kuna Levia, but her father should be indicated as such, Chana Bas Chaim Ha-Levi, the same thing. The Rabbi Elyashiv said, if you want to add Nun Yud after the name of the chosson, fine. After the kallah, Tichya is not advisable. Because if you write Sarah Tichya, it might seem like her name is Sarah Tichya. So better write Sarah Shet Tichya, and that's obviously a title going back on the kallah, not a name. What to me was surprising, but Lamaisa, it's the Gedolei HaPoskim that says this psak, that today, maybe there's a reason to write the chosson and kallah's last name into the Ksuba. Now, I know this is surprising, but let me explain. Generally, in all of Yiddishkeit, last name man b'char shmei. It doesn't have any halachic bearing a last name. More so regarding get, the Ramah says in Kuf Chav Tes Sif Tes Zayin, that the get is only the proper Yiddish name without any other names, including a last name. However, Rav Moshe, in Even Ezer Chelik Aleph Siman Kuf Ayin Ches, he writes that although there's no chiyuv to put a last name in, but he thinks it's very strongly advisable to have a last name. And the cheshbon is very pashut. In the olden days, they lived in small shtetnach, basically. How often was there that Shnei Yosef ben Shimon be'ir achas? But today we live in big cities. It could be on the same night there are people getting married with the same name. So Moshe then adds that by a get we're not so concerned, because by a get you add the miskaria this, the miskaria that, nicknames. So it's not so common that there's going to be the same identical names. But Kedush, that's only the name Yosef ben Shimon, you have a problem. You might end up having Shnei Yosef ben Shimon be'ir achas. There's no identification who got married. I rather once saw this, many years ago in Tarvadas, where Belski Zechon Levracha, the name's Yisrael, ben Rab Doiv HaLevi, and there was the Rav in Lakewood, his name is Yisrael Reisman, cousin of the Reisman in Flatbush, whose name is also Yisrael ben Doiv HaLevi. So he wanted to give the other, Reisman Aliyah, said, what's your Zayd's name? He said, Yisrael. Rab Belski's Zayd's also name was Yisrael. So it was Yisrael ben Doiv ben Yisrael HaLevi in the same little Beis Medrash. So you see how common it is that you could have the same names? So this was the issue of Rav Moshe. So Rav Moshe, in a later tshuva, Chelik Dalet, Siman Mem Sid Kot and Chaf, he says, I didn't say it's a chiyuv, but definitely there's enough of chashash that it warrants adding a last name. Now I believe Rav Moshe was also understanding that a get we can't play around with and start adding things, because a get has much more chamadik halachis. But a ksuba is a little more lenient in that respect. So Rav Moshe says more so. He does add that, again, it's not a chiyuv, but it's advisable. Now Rav Moshe himself says, if you don't write a last name, I can't say it's possible, for the very simple reason that who said, punkt, you can have someone that got married at the same time with the same name? You don't have a chashash lefanecha, but this is what Rav Moshe adds. And he does say that if you do write the last name, don't write Hamachuna, Hamachuna Goldman, because that might sound like the chosson's nickname is Goldman. Better write more clearly Lemishpachas Goldman. That's Rav Moshe's losh. Now, to me, what was a chiddush is Rav Moshe not the only one. Rabbi Yashiv in Chelik Dalet and the Chuvas Kuf Samach Beis was asked by Rav Levi Rabinovich, the father of Rav Gamliel, at one of the Kiyadashi B'Shalayim, Adam Godel Ma'oid. He wrote to Rabbi Yashiv, and his letter is printed in the Chuvas of Rabbi Yashiv, that the Eizem Kodesh, the Buchacha writes that if a Ksuba doesn't have the legal validity in Dina the Machusa, maybe the Ksuba is possible. So Rabbi Rabinovich wrote a Ksuba without a last name in the courts that doesn't stand on its own feet. So maybe you have to add a last name for that reason. So Rabbi Yash says, I'm not worried about that because Lamais, you have a marriage contract, you go and your marriage license, you go in the courts. But Rav Moshe's reason is the right reason. And he sends you to Igros Moshe. I'm worried about Shnei Yos Ben Shimon Be'er Achas. And then I saw a third reason, a more simple reason, that basically you have to write the chosson's name. No, in our times, the last name is an integral part of everybody's name. So this is why not only Rav Moshe, Rabbi Yashiv, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman was very forceful to write a last name. In fact, the story is told in the Sefer Shalmei Simcha Amud Reish Samach Tes. When he was a younger man, he was together by a chasana with Yosef Jasinski, the Av Bezin Shalayim. And the Av Bezin asked Rabbi Shlomo Zalman to write the Ksuba, and he'll be the Tzaddik Kedushim. And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman wrote Kefit Havanasai with the last name. Rabbi Yosef looked at it and said, last name? No, write over. We don't write with last name, write another one over. And he wanted to argue with Rabbi Yosef Tzvi. So there was a Rav there that the Leckenbacher Rav said, don't argue with him because he's not going to give in. You just give in. So Rabbi Zalman did that. He wrote over another Ksuba. And afterwards he decided that he's going to write last names. And he was thankful that he didn't argue with Rabbi Yosef Tzvi. Because had he argued and he would say, no, the minig is not to write a last name, he would not be able to write last names. But since he didn't argue, so he didn't get a psak fakert, Kol Yomav, he added a last name to a Ksuba in parentheses, als covered for the Rabbi Yosef Jasinski. But you see how much he was convinced that the last name is integral to a Ksuba. So to me it was interesting, you have Gedolei Yisrael Hashem Epiyim Anu Chayim, and for three different reasons, either Al Dina the Machusa, or that's the name, or Yosef Ben Shimon, they dafka insisted on writing a last name. However, Paik Chazi, most Ksubas don't have a last name. I would imagine it's the old Yisoich, Leishinu Eshmam, we have a certain Messiah. It's interesting, the Chasam Sof and Parshas Miketz learns Pshat in the Pasuk, Yosef, Vayetze Yosef al Mitzrayim, he learns a beautiful Musa Deher. Yosef had a new name, Tzafas Paneach, Pari gave him the name, but he fifed it on. My name is Yosef, I'm proud of that. Vayetze Yosef al Mitzrayim. And Zok Chasam Sof, that's why in Parshas Vayechi he showed his father a Ksuba. What's the grace kind of showing a Ksuba? Look, I still have my name. I'm still Yosef. I'm not Tzafas Paneach. So there's a certain sensitivity that Yidden have to Messiah. I'm not saying Rav Moshe or Rabbi Asher or Shlomo Zalman were breaching the Messiah. They felt that's what's appropriate. What we could say is Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. But one thing we will say, that the fact that there are different Yosef and Shimon is not a problem until it results in a problem. You worry about it then. Also, I want to point out that if you do have a first name, only once is enough. You don't have to write it every single time. And especially for the kallah, after she's referred to as Maras, it's probably wrong to write her last name because now basically she's under a new management. She has a new last name, so that's certainly inappropriate to put it then. Once you fill out the actual Ksuba, it's important, and this is based on in Chayshemish Mem Hey Yud Aleph, that we don't leave any blank spaces in a Ksuba. Now, let's look at the Ksuba in front of you. There's a long line space to fill in the date, Lamashal, or the chosson's name. Now, let's say the Saifa, whoever it is, there's a long space to fill out the chosson's name. The chosson has a short name, Tzvi Ben Chaim. So then the space after his name is left blank. And we're concerned about that because someone could add and play around with the Ksuba. He could add amount of money, he could add the date. So typically after the names and everything is filled out, after the Torah is filled out, any blank space is supposed to be filled out. It's called tiyut, the Mechaber's Lashon. Put a line in just to blank this, that shouldn't be left blank, that leaves room for any playing around with. I was once by a chassan attack of someone else from Tzaddik Kedusha, and Rapam was there, and he saw it because it wasn't filled out, so in a very smart way, he basically filled it out quickly that the other Rav shouldn't see or feel, insulted. The last words of the Ksuba is Hakol Shorer V'Kayim. You'll see that's cross number 9. That's basically to show that this is strong, Shorer is strong in Kayim. That's more needed when there's a correction that's done, and you have to write that correction. You have to write, this was corrected, and after everything you add Hakol Shorer V'Kayim, this correction was done, and part of it is certified as well. What's very important, which has to be explained, is the Kabbalah's Kinyan. Now you have to realize the chosson did not commit himself yet to any type of Ksuba. Now of course the Ksuba deraisa, or the Ksuba that's a chiyav, is mushba ba'oimid, it's not up to him to accept. But a big part of the Ksuba is the Tosefes Ksuba, who said he was makabel. Maybe they forced it down his throat, he didn't want it. So that's why it's important to make a Kabbalah's Kinyan. Basically, the chosson is not paying the Ksuba. Hopefully he'll never have to pay the Ksuba. He's being makabel Kinyan, that if it does eventually turn to that, he will be willing to pay. Now, how do you do something like that? So if you remember, Gradis and Yana the Yom coming up, the Antav of Shuas, we remember the Kinyan of Chalipin. One of the ways of making a Kinyan is that you give something to someone, and he's kind of that, and by kind of that, he's makna, he gives something else. Lamashal. We just had it not long ago, you go to the Rav, and you want him to sell your chametz for you, so you pick up his item, the kallah of shell koina, you pick up his handkerchief, let's say, so you koina his handkerchief, and with that, you're being makna the chametz to him to sell to the guy. Well, that's the way it works here also. The chosson has to be makna the shibud, the chi of shibud, that he's accepting it. How does he do that? The Adim are really on behalf of the kallah. They are working out the Kabbalah's Kinyan. We paskin in Choshen Mishpat, in Kuf Tzadikei Siv Beis, Chalipin works b'kelev shel koina. The Adim want to be koina this shibud that the chosson is promising to do. So they give the chosson their handkerchief l'mashal, that was the old minig. He picks it up and he's koina their handkerchief, but he's not getting a chosson a gift. I mean, he wants to look at it like that, it's fine. But with that, he's being makna his shibud of the $10,000 or whatever it is of the Ksuba. So he's kind of the handkerchief, but he's being makna his shibud to if there is an eventual chi of Ksuba. So that's why really the truth is that the Masada Kedushin is Masada the Kedushin. That's his job. If you look at all the earlier Paiskim, and I mean the earlier Paiskim going back to the Tashbitz and the Marmins, they all say that the Eidim are the ones that make the Kabbalah's Kinyan. They are Masada Kabbalah's Kinyan. And the truth is, you look at the Ksuba, that's the way it seems. Because the end of the Ksuba, it writes, V'kanena, we were Makabal Kinyan from the chosson, and then they signed their names. If you look at number 8, V'kanena min from the chosson. Here, rather, they have a title in this Ksuba, it's funny. But we were Makabal from the chosson, the chi of Ksuba, and then they signed their names like we validate the Kabbalah's Kinyan. So technically, from all the earlier Paiskim, it's clear that the Eidim were the Mesadre Kabbalah's Kinyan. Rav Vosner writes in the Tshuva Chelik Ches Reish Pei Hey that Lamais, it's better if the Eidim do it, but sometimes the Eidim are not qualified, they don't know how to do, what to do. So he says, I get involved, I give them what to do. But if the Eidim could do it on their own, that's preferable. But I think more often than not, the Masada Kedushin, make sure it's done. The main kapeda is to use the kallah of shel koina and not the kallah of course, shel makna of the chosson. What could be used to make this Kabbalah's Kinyan? And this is negeh to any chalipin. When you go to the Rav on Mechiras Chametz. So in Choshen Mishpat Kuf Tzadikei Siv Beis, you don't need much. It can even be less than a pruta, but it has to be a keli gomer. You can't use something that doesn't last. It has to be a complete keli. Now, typically a complete keli has the dimensions of a gimel et spois, which is approximately 2 or 3 inches. It has to be something of substance. And that's why the minig always was that use a handkerchief. A handkerchief is a keli. It's bigger than gimel or gimel at spois. Some people started using a pen or a gartel, which some question because a gartel or a pen are not gimel or gimel at spois. But the emes is, if you look in Choshen Mishpat, you'll see this clearly. Gimel or gimel at spois just indicates that it's a complete keli. A pen or a gartel is a complete keli. So again, the pen or the gartel can be used. It has to be a kli shalim. Some say, I saw a particular pickbook, a pen maybe is disposable, and disposable tak is not a keli, but the emes of a pen is not disposable. We treat it as disposable. I mean, you could buy a refill and reuse it. So that's already a stickle of Aita Chumrah. Now, a tissue, you might say is good because you don't have to have a pruta. But a tissue is disposable. That's not a shem keli. But a pen, it's hard to believe that that's considered disposable. I saw an incredible ma'aser shahaya. The Adim didn't have their own handkerchief, so they picked up one of the cloth napkins from the catering hall, and they made the whole kabbalas kinyan. After, some said, "What are you doing? It's not yours. It belongs to the caterer. It belongs to the hall." So interesting. The Hayras Nasan, your Aleph Kuf Chav Zayin, paskins that could be it was not a valid kabbalas kinyan. It's not yours. A mitzvah very ain't a mitzvah. And I found other Heintige points that said the same thing. You know, so what I did see in the Sefer Seder Ksuba chosson in Amud Lamed Dal, he quotes Rav Vosna that was makel based on a Chiddush Pella in Even Ezer Siman Chav Ches Sif Yud Zayin. The Ramah says if you have a guest come to your house during the week and you give him a piece of kugel, and he's an interesting guest, and he's Mekadosh an Isha with that piece of kugel. Instead of eating it, he's Mekadosh an Isha with that your piece of kugel. The Ramah says the Kedushin is good. Because if you gave it to him to eat, could be you gave it to him, it's ganz in his. So Rav says maybe if they give you to use, it's like yours at that point. Of course, the dimin is not so perfect, but that's why it's not a good idea to use something of the caterer unless, of course, you ask Rishus. I saw a scary story that the Adim used their pen to make the kabbalas kinyan, and after they realized it wasn't their pen. It wasn't even someone else's pen, someone had given it to them to hold. So it wasn't like the caterer's hall, or hall's thing. That's a serious problem. Another point I wanted to mention is when the chosson has to be kaina, the item they give, the handkerchief, whatever it is. So we know you have to pick it up gimel tvachim. Now that's nothing wrong with that, but that's not really necessary, because if you have something in your hand entirely, that itself, holding the chayv entirely, is the kabbalas kinyan. We pick it up gimel tvachim. I guess we feel more holy. It doesn't hurt. But you only pick up 3 tvachim is when you only have something partially. But if the whole thing is in their hands, that would be enough. Another point that I wanted to mention is when you do have the kabbalas kinyan, when does it take place? So you're wondering, what's a shayla? You do it like everything by the kabbalas panim. If you look in the earlier paiskim, it was done after the erison, after the Masada Kedushin was Masada Kedushin. In between the erison and the Berchas Nesuin, that's when they made the kabbalas kinyan. They actually made the kabbalas kinyan. Then they wrote the word v'kanena. Kanena is a lashon rabbim. We made the kinyan to Adim, and then they signed under the chuppah. Now this is rishonim, gedolei rishonim. What's the maila? Because otherwise it's like it's almost like merzik shikra. You're signing v'kanena. You weren't even married yet. What are you doing? So that's why. And ad hayoim the minig yishalayim is that they fill out the Ksuba before. The kabbalas kinyan and the kanena and the signing is done under the chuppah. Now this has a logistical problem because under the chuppah is not the right place to start making kinyanim. And also, how do Adim sign? So some people volunteer their backs, sign on my back, which obviously is not the preference. I know some of the Eretz Yisrael say signing on someone else's back, then it's not your signature. And people start questioning that. It doesn't look like yours. It's not mine. I was signing on hanging from someone's back. It's just not proper. So Lamaisa, this is not the minig throughout Eretz Yisrael, but I know the minig Eretz Yisrael is to try as much as possible to sign under the chuppah. In other words, they make the kabbalas kinyan under the chuppah, they write v'kanena, and then they sign. The minig in most places, you do this everything by the kabbalas panim. Kanena, how could you write it now? Why not? You did make the kinyan now, what's wrong? And then they sign, as long as there was no yet, it's not merzik shikah because there's no sheker. They didn't sign until afterwards. So the two menhagim, elu ve'elu divrei likim chayim. As far as the order of the Adim signing, so the Shulchan HaEzer Chav Daled Amud Beis says that the order, you go with the age, don't look who's the bigger Talmid Chacham, that would be embarrassing. The older person signs first, on the line, as you see, and number 10, and then the younger person signs afterwards. If one is a Kayin, so the Kayin goes first, that's the pasuk in the Torah, but generally we go in order of age. Some have a minig, and I saw in the Stiples Ksuba, he himself, I could recognize his handwriting, he himself signed his Ksuba. Now, the Paiskim say, if the chosson signed, it's a good idea, that gives more validity to kabbalas kinyan. But he shouldn't sign under the Adim, because then it looks like he's another Aid, and that's going to be problematic. So you put the chsima on the other side where the Adim sign. And this, if you look at the Ksuba in front of you, number 11, the chosson sign on the other side, and the Adim sign on the right side, and the chosson on the left side. And last but certainly not least, which is a achrein hichbid, is probably the most common question in this time of the year, early summer, when let's say a person getting married, Beis Nissan, and it's called for 6:30, and the Kedushin comes on time and fills out the Ksuba, and everything is filled out, 7:15. Shkia is 7:30. Let's say Beis, and let's assume that will be the Shkia for that day. Now, the problem is, until they actually get married, the chupah is like an hour later. So they actually got married after Tzeis, and which really Gimel Nissan. So the problem is that they wrote on the Ksuba Beis Nissan. They got married Gimel Nissan, that's not just Mechzi Kashikah, that's a Shtar Mugdam. And Mechab in Chayshim Mishpat says the Farish and Mem Gimel Zayin, a Mugdam is absolutely possible. You're giving more the ability to collect from a day early. And that's certainly possible. And the emes is, if the cipher made a mistake, or the cipher or the artist made a mistake and wrote the wrong date, and it's a mugdam, it's absolutely possible even with the Evid. And that's why some Paiskim say, in such a case, don't write the date Beis Nissan. Better write the date Gimel Nissan. Why? In the worst scenario, if you got married Beis Nissan, what could be wrong? It's a mu'ucha. Get mu'ucha is kasha. Now, I was wondering, but one second, but where's the protection of the kallah? You have to have protection at all times. She's getting married Beis, and the Ksuba's first Gimel. So I hope the answer is that there's such a small lapse in the protection of the Ksuba, so there's not a chashash that in that time they'll get divorced and they'll not want to pay. That's something very unreasonable. But I want to tell you that there are some that are concerned about this. However, the overwhelming majority of the Paiskim are makel for a very simple reason. If you look at the Ksuba, the thrust of the Ksuba is the Kabbalah's Kinyan. It's not so much about getting married. The Kabbalah's Kinyan did take place Beis Nissan. It's not a Mechzi Kashikra. That was when the Kanena, and that's what he promised to give. And that's why you'll see, I saw a long list of Paiskim that felt as long as the Kabbalah's Kinyan took place on Beis, you could write Beis, the Chatchila. We said get Mugdim is possible, Star Mugdim is possible. True. If the Cipher wrote Aleph Nissan, and the Chassan was Beis, and nothing happened on Aleph, that's taka problem. But if it's Beis going into Gimel, and the Kabbalah's Kinyan was on Beis, it would be okay. Reb Shlomo Zalman, and this is printed in the Mincha Shleim with Tinyana Simon Kuf Chav Ches, heard this argument and disagreed. But part of the Ksubas, like Reb Shlomo Zalman, it says about that he got married. And he writes something hypothetical. Let's say the Adim came and they say, this girl got married to someone on Beis Nissan. We saw her Makabel Kedushin. You'll say, just throw it out because she got married to him. But it's not true. She really got married on Gimel Nissan. Now the emes is, what are the chances of this happening? 0. But he's trying to bring out his point that it's a sheker. How do you sign on sheker? You sign she got married on Beis when it's Gimel? So Hitaka says, I can't say it's possible, but it's inappropriate to sign on a date Beis when she got married on Gimel. Now, Rav Zalman used a pretty mild lashon, but Rabbi Moshe in Dalit Kufhei in Ebenezer says in such a Ksuba is possible. If the Chasser was Kulei Gimel, just they wrote the Ksuba in Beis, that's a get, that's a star, that's possible. Lamaisa, the minig ha'olam, I think, as long as you made the Kabbalah's Kinyan on the day by day Beis, and you wrote Beis, it's okay. If someone knows that it might go late, it's much better to write Gimel. Reb Shlomo Zalman, I told you, filled out the Ksuba in his house. He left the date blank. He came to the Chasana, and if it was going on schedule and it would be Taka Beis, he wrote Beis. If it was schlepping, he would fill out Gimel. This way he avoided all problems. The Ikkas, we should make Simchas. I got to talk to you all.
Shem Egenshire, I'd like to give a big yashakar to Rav Smith for delivering today's shir, but Tuv Tam with us as always. I'd also like to give a big yashakar to Mishpacha Center for sponsoring today's shir, the Nishmas Aviyam, Zechariah, Rabbi Zechariah Levracha, Rabbi Center, Rabbi Zechariah Center from the Chav K, was just nifter, and was Mishtata from Chazak the Shiurim all the years. Tenish Moshe Tzir B'Sar Chaim. Rav Smith was Bezasham said the sikkim of today's share after Mincha. Rav Nanya ben Akashem Ratzak Kadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakis Es Yisrael Lefikir Hiblim Torah Mitzvahs V'Nema Al Nechofes Aman Tzidko Yagel Torah V'Yadeh.